The scent of warm vanilla and tangy lemon zest filled the air as the early morning sun bathed the windows of the Whiskers Nook, a modest bakery tucked between a dry cleaner and a used bookstore on Hawthorne Boulevard in Portland, Oregon. Inside, the clinking of spoons, the hiss of the espresso machine, and the soft crooning of Ella Fitzgerald wove together in the comforting hum of routine. 25-year-old Emery Hale moved like muscle memory behind the counter, her chestnut curls tied up in a loose knot, apron dusted with flour, eyes tired but kind. Her life had been shaped by the rhythm of this space, by scones at dawn, pastries by noon, and a few leftover croissants she'd sneak home to share with her sister, June, and their ailing mother, Ruth Ann Hale. After her father vanished when she was 12, Emery stepped into the void, first helping her mother fold laundry, then running the house by 16. Her dream had always been to open her own bakery, one where every flavor had a story, every recipe whispered memory, but dreams were luxuries for those who didn't carry whole families on their backs. Emery's world was careful, deliberate, and filled with the kind of quiet sorrow that makes a woman good at pretending everything is fine. She kept journals, hidden in tins behind the spice rack, filled with sketches of cake tears, poetry written in grease-stained ink, and business plans that read like love letters to a future that felt farther every year. Emery was a woman who made magic from scraps, who stitched joy from discount linens and wrote hope in powdered sugar. But she was tired. June, just 19, was brilliant but scatterbrained, flitting from pre-nursing classes to part-time jobs, often forgetting her textbooks or showing up to class in her apron from work. Their mother, once the proud owner of a vintage dress shop, was now a shadow tethered to oxygen tanks and old photo albums, her lungs slowly betraying her. Still, there was a strange peace in the chaos, in the way Emery balanced grief and survival, until a Wednesday morning, rainy and gray, changed everything. She had just placed a tray of lemon tarts by the window when the bell chimed and in stepped Colin Ward, dark coat, sharp features, and eyes that seemed too curious for a stranger. He looked out of place, like a silk tie in a linen shop, but there was something disarming in the way he blinked at the pastries, clearly overwhelmed. "I need something sweet," he said, "but I don't know what." Emery raised a brow, half smiling. "That depends on the kind of day you've had." Colin Ward had never tasted lemon curd before, and certainly not the kind Emery made, smooth and tart, with flecks of rosemary folded into the buttery crust. He took a bite, eyes widening, and for a moment, time stalled. "This tastes like something important," he said, not realizing how right he was. Over the next 10 minutes, he asked her 3 questions: how long she'd been baking, if she liked jazz, and whether she'd ever consider selling her recipes. She answered all of them cautiously, amused but skeptical. He left with 2 pastries and a business card she almost didn't give him, and the next day, he returned, no coat, no tie, just jeans and a story about how that tart reminded him of his mother's old garden. What Emery didn't know, couldn't have possibly guessed, was that Colin wasn't just another charmer in a suit. He was an investment analyst on sabbatical after a Wall Street burnout, hiding in Portland while debating his future. That rainy Wednesday would be the first of many visits, the first of many questions, the beginning of a story neither of them could see coming, and the first crack in the safe, quiet world Emery Hale had spent years protecting. Colin Ward had grown up in a world where affection was something you had to earn, and even then, it came with terms and expiration dates. Born into privilege in Greenwich, Connecticut, he was the second son in a family that valued lineage over love, results over resilience. His father, Charles Ward, was a retired judge with an ego larger than the mahogany shelves lining their estate's private library, while his older brother Graham was the golden child, brilliant, ambitious, already enrolled in Harvard Law by the time Colin finished his sophomore year of high school. Their mother, Angela Ward, was softer, a pianist who filled the house with Schubert and sweet-smelling lavender sachets, but her battle with ovarian cancer ended when Colin was 17. Her passing was the only time Charles cried, and even then, only once. Colin had never truly forgiven him for how quickly her photos were replaced with accolades and oil paintings of former wards. Driven to escape that suffocating legacy, Colin dove headfirst into the world of finance, building himself from intern to analyst at a New York firm, pushing through bloodshot eyes and brutal deadlines, until the ambition that once fueled him began to rot him from the inside out. By the time he landed in Portland on a forced leave due to burnout, he hadn't smiled in months. But something about Emery's bakery, the scent of citrus and sugar, the messy charm of the hand-drawn chalkboard menus, the subtle peace, pulled him in like a warm tide after a long winter. He kept going back, ordering things he couldn't pronounce just to hear her laugh, asking about her pastries and slowly learning about her life. He discovered she was the oldest daughter of a widowed seamstress, that she once had a scholarship to culinary school but gave it up after her father vanished. He learned that she named her almond biscotti after her grandmother and that she hated wearing shoes in the kitchen because she liked to feel the ground beneath her feet. He noticed she never asked why he was in Portland or what he did for a living. She simply handed him pastries and smiles, letting the silence fill with a kind of unspoken permission. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, something inside Colin began to shift. His days stopped beginning with spreadsheets and started with the chime of the bakery bell. The first time she smiled at him over the rim of her coffee mug, he felt a pull he hadn't felt in years, not lust, but safety. A place to land. Their first official outing wasn't a date, not really. It was a Wednesday night in March when Emery mentioned a local jazz club, the Velvet Vine, where her friend Kaya occasionally performed. "You should come," she said, wiping powdered sugar from her arm. "You look like someone who used to love music." He did. In another life, his mother's piano filled every hallway of their home, and for a moment, the memory clutched him by the throat. He showed up, sat at the back, and watched Emery sway gently to Kaya's rendition of Misty under the soft blue lights. Afterward, they walked 2 miles in silence beneath a misting rain, her laughter echoing off the sidewalks. She told him about her childhood dreams of baking in Paris, how her mom once made clothes from curtain fabric, and how she still wore the necklace her dad gave her the day before he left, a locket with no picture inside. Colin listened like it was scripture. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking of profits or performance reviews, but of Emery, the girl who wore lemon stains like war paint and healed people with butter and sugar. That night, she told him he didn't have to be anyone for her. Just present. Just honest. And for a man raised behind masks and marble walls, it was the most terrifying thing anyone had ever said, and the most beautiful. It began with wildflowers. Not the kind bought in grocery stores, but the ones you have to bend your knees to pick, crooked stems, imperfect petals, stubbornly growing between sidewalk cracks and grassy fields. Emery had a habit of pressing them into her journal pages, between poetry and recipes, a quiet testament to finding beauty in things the world overlooked. It was spring when Colin proposed, and the Portland sun was finally stretching its fingers over the rooftops again. He had spent weeks planning it, not in a grand, over-the-top way, but in a way that would speak her language. He asked Kaya to distract her for the afternoon. He took her to Willow Creek Meadow, a small clearing near the Columbia River Gorge where the wildflowers grew in careless abundance. Emery wore a faded yellow dress that danced around her knees as she laughed and pulled daisies from the ground. She was barefoot, as usual, and holding a basket filled with berries and cheese. Colin was shaking so hard he almost dropped the ring. When he dropped to one knee, she gasped, not because she hadn't thought about it, she had, but because the look in his eyes wasn't flashy or rehearsed. It was raw. "I want to build a life that tastes like the way you bake," he said, fumbling the words, imperfect, but warm. "Real." She said yes with tears in her eyes and dirt on her hands. He slipped a simple ring onto her finger, one that once belonged to his mother. The engagement ushered in a season of joy, of possibility, of daring to believe in forever. Emery moved into Colin's modest loft apartment on Burnside Street, 2 windows, 1 broken radiator, and a leaky sink that always dripped in Morse code. But she loved it. She hung up her own art, scribbled dessert ideas on the walls in chalk, and turned the tiny kitchen into her kingdom. Kaya threw them a rooftop engagement party lit with string lights and mismatched candles, inviting everyone from local musicians to her ex-girlfriends, claiming Emery was the only woman she'd ever trust not to fall for one of them. Colin's best friend Benji Alden flew in from Chicago for the weekend, a whip-smart tech developer with a sarcastic mouth and a heart softer than his designer boots. Emery instantly loved him for how he teased Colin relentlessly but still hugged her like family. That night, surrounded by music and laughter, Emery felt like her life was expanding in every direction, a garden of hope blooming beneath her feet. But not everyone raised their glass with sincerity. Graham Ward stood in the corner near the drinks, watching the scene unfold with a half-smile that didn't touch his eyes. Graham approached Colin the next day with a warning disguised as advice. Over bourbon at a quiet cigar bar near downtown, he leaned in close and said, "You're betting your future on someone who doesn't belong to our world." Colin didn't respond immediately, but his jaw clenched. Graham went on, reminding him of their family's reputation, their circle, their name. You're marrying someone who works with flour and dreams. That's charming, sure, but dreams don't buy legacy, little brother. It stung, not because Colin believed it, but because a part of him feared Graham might be right. The old insecurities surfaced, about status, respectability, and what others would whisper behind champagne flutes. Still, he defended Emery. Fiercely. But Emery noticed a change after that conversation. Colin grew quieter about wedding plans, began taking more calls late into the night, and occasionally stared at their budget spreadsheet like it was a minefield. When she asked if everything was okay, he kissed her forehead and said, "Of course. I just want to give you more than wildflowers." Emery didn't need more. But Colin, slowly, was beginning to forget that. And far beneath the surface of their blooming love, a silent tension was beginning to root itself, one that would take months to reveal just how poisonous it would become. The early months of their marriage were wrapped in the kind of golden simplicity Emery had always imagined, not perfect, but sincere. They rented a one-bedroom apartment on the quieter edge of northeast Portland, tucked between a neighborhood park and an old bookshop that smelled like vanilla and ink. Emery brought color to the space with hand-sewn curtains, antique mugs from thrift stores, and a rotating gallery of handwritten recipes pinned above the sink. Mornings began with shared coffee and laughter over burnt toast, and evenings ended with Emery curled against Colin's chest, tracing dreams on his arm like stories she hadn't yet written. She opened a tiny pop-up stand on weekends, selling hand-piped cupcakes and rosemary scones outside Kaya's theater. Colin would stop by between client calls, proudly bringing her warm cider and teasing her about being the queen of butter. Their world wasn't wealthy, but it was rooted, grounded in softness, banter, and shared dreams. Yet beneath the warmth, a quiet current had begun to pulse in Colin, a hunger to prove himself beyond the shadows of his family name. He started spending more hours on his laptop, browsing job listings outside Portland. Just browsing, he'd say, but his gaze often drifted east, toward the power of New York's skyline and the life he'd almost lived before Emery. When the job offer came from a boutique investment firm in Manhattan, Colin presented it like a harmless option. 6 months, he promised. They want someone to clean up their portfolio structure, then we come home. We could finally save for your bakery. Maybe even buy a place. He framed it as a necessary step, a sacrifice that would lead to something better. Emery tried to smile. Tried to be supportive. But a part of her heart wilted quietly that day, like herbs left too long in the sun. Portland was home. It held her roots, her family, her memories, the graves of people she once loved and the laughter of those still holding her hand. Moving meant leaving behind her weekends with June, her mother's shrinking health, Kaya's rehearsals, and the fragile bakery dream that was just beginning to breathe. But she said yes. Because marriage, she believed, was about compromise. About standing beside each other even when the direction felt uncertain. And so they packed their lives into cardboard boxes, kissed Kaya goodbye, and boarded a flight toward a city Emery didn't love but promised to try for Colin's sake. She told herself it was temporary. She didn't know how far from the truth that would become. It was a Tuesday in early October when the rain came down in sheets and Emery stood soaked beneath a broken umbrella on the corner of Madison Avenue, waiting for Colin outside his new office. She had spent the morning at home making his favorite honey ginger cookies and the afternoon searching for kitchen rentals to explore restarting her bakery in New York. She'd gotten lost twice, soaked through, and nearly hit by a cab, but she showed up, hopeful, clutching the cookie tin like a love offering. When Colin emerged, suit perfect, smile tired, he was flanked by colleagues, polished women and sharp-tongued men who looked at Emery like a quaint footnote. He seemed distracted, distant. "You didn't have to come," he said, eyes darting toward his watch. "We could have just texted." Emery laughed, awkwardly. "You said you missed me." There was a pause. "I did," he replied, but his tone lacked warmth. As the others left, Colin pulled her under a shop awning, the city buzzing around them, headlights reflecting in puddles. Emery, frustrated, finally asked, "Do you even want me here?" His silence hurt more than any insult. And then, as if the universe needed to punctuate the moment, thunder cracked overhead. Emery turned to leave. But Colin, at last, reached for her wrist, spun her back into his arms, and kissed her under the storm. It was a kiss full of apology, of desperation, of longing. They laughed, water dripping from their hair, and danced for a few seconds like fools beneath the gray sky. It was fleeting, beautiful, even, but the kind of moment that masks rather than mends. That night, Emery would press her wet dress into the bathroom sink, watching the makeup streak down the mirror, wondering if rain could wash away what was already beginning to break. The apartment in Manhattan felt nothing like home. It was sleek, clinical, all granite countertops and black leather couches, the kind of place made for guests, not living. Emery tried to fill it with warmth. She hung eucalyptus branches in the shower, filled the kitchen with spice jars and handwritten notes, and kept a small garden of potted herbs on the windowsill. But Colin was rarely there to notice. His new job had swallowed him whole: late nights, weekend meetings, endless dinners with clients. He returned each night smelling of cologne and conference rooms, often too tired to talk. Emery told herself it was just an adjustment phase. That every couple went through moments like this. But still, the silence between them began to hum louder than the city itself. Her days stretched into a monotony of loneliness. Without friends or family nearby, Emery wandered the neighborhoods, journal in hand, sketching bakery designs on napkins, observing strangers and dreaming of lives where women didn't wait at windows. She found a small community kitchen uptown, rented by the hour, and began baking again in secret, not to sell, but to survive. It was the only time she felt like herself. Then came Vivian Doyle. Colin's boss, statuesque, poised, brilliant in ways Emery admired and feared. Vivian was everything Emery wasn't: polished, pedigreed, and unapologetically ambitious. She met Vivian at a company mixer, one of those bland, catered events where everyone talks with half smiles and drinks things with names Emery couldn't pronounce. Vivian introduced herself with a perfectly manicured hand and a compliment that felt like a backhanded slap: "You must be the one who makes the adorable cupcakes." Emery smiled politely, but something in her stomach twisted. Throughout the evening, she watched Vivian hover around Colin, brushing his arm as she laughed too hard, whispering things that made him smile in a way Emery hadn't seen in weeks. When she asked him about it later, he said, "Don't be insecure. She's my boss, Em. She's like that with everyone." But the distance between them was no longer a theory, it was a fact. Emery started sleeping alone more often, pretending not to hear him typing emails at 2 a.m., or the way he'd lock his phone when she walked into the room. He had once called her his muse, his morning piece. Now he barely noticed when she left the apartment for hours, sometimes even days. The miscarriage happened on a Thursday. Emery had been alone all day, feeling unwell, thinking it was just fatigue or a stomach bug. She hadn't told Colin about the pregnancy yet. It was too early, and after all the distance between them, she wanted the timing to be right. She'd even written a note, tucked inside a box with baby-themed cookies she had decorated herself, planning to surprise him that evening. But by mid-afternoon, the cramps worsened, and the blood came fast. She collapsed in the kitchen, the scent of cinnamon rising around her like a cruel contrast to the pain. She crawled to the bathroom, clutching her phone with shaking hands, calling Kaya instead of 911, because she couldn't bear to go through it with strangers. Kaya answered, took a train that night from Portland without hesitation, and held her best friend through 2 days of physical and emotional hell. Colin didn't come home until the following morning. His excuse? Client dinner ran late. Emery didn't tell him. She couldn't. Something in her had already died, not just the baby, but the hope that their love could still be repaired. She stood in the doorway, watching him peel off his coat and ask if they had milk. Milk. That was all he could think to say. And just like that, the final crack split through the porcelain of their marriage, not loud, not messy, but devastating in its quietness. She smiled faintly and said, "I'll get more tomorrow," knowing full well she wouldn't. Rain tapped softly against the apartment window like the echo of all the words Emery had never spoken aloud. She sat on the floor of the hallway closet, knees pulled to her chest, surrounded by boxes she hadn't opened since the move to New York. The power had gone out in the building temporarily, leaving her in shadows, but she didn't bother with candles or flashlights. Her hands moved almost mechanically through the flaps of cardboard until she found a smaller box labeled in faded marker, Dad. Inside were old photos, a pair of suspenders her father once wore while painting, and a bundle of aged envelopes tied with a blue ribbon. Emery's breath caught. They were letters she had written between the ages of 12 and 15, after her father disappeared without goodbye. She had mailed them faithfully, one every birthday, every Christmas, every milestone. And they had all come back, unopened, unread, and marked return to sender. Emery had kept them anyway, tucked away like a wound she didn't want to heal. Her fingers trembled as she untied the ribbon and unfolded the first one. The handwriting was younger, shakier, filled with hope. Dear Dad, I made cupcakes today. Mom cried because she burned the lasagna again, but June made a funny face and we laughed. I wish you were here. Emery read until the words blurred into tears. She hadn't cried over her father in years, not since her heart hardened to the reality that he had chosen to leave them. But in that dark closet, with lightning crawling across the sky and her marriage slipping into silence, Emery felt like that 12-year-old girl again, alone, forgotten, asking the universe why. Outside her broken world, Kaya had returned to Portland after the miscarriage, swearing she would come back in a month once her new school project was set. June, now entering her second year of nursing school, called every night, always with questions about Mom's prescriptions or Emery's meals. Emery lied, told her everything was fine, that Colin was just busy and the city was just cold. She didn't tell her that she hadn't slept next to her husband in nearly 2 weeks, or that she'd started cooking meals for 2 and throwing half of them out, untouched. She didn't say how often she found herself staring at her reflection, wondering when she had stopped recognizing the girl who once laughed so easily at flower fights and loved the smell of sun-warmed strawberries. Emery began pouring her thoughts into her journal again, a fresh one, the spine stiff and unforgiving. She no longer wrote bakery recipes. Now, she wrote down questions. When did he stop seeing me? Why do I feel invisible? What do I do with this pain that never speaks but never leaves? She didn't show these pages to anyone. They were her sanctuary and her confession booth. The apartment that once held promise now held only echoes. Colin had become a guest in her life, not a partner. And Emery, who had once made homes out of crumbs and warmth, now stood in the center of luxury with frost in her bones. Then came the birthday. It was her 27th, not that she'd reminded anyone. She baked herself a small lemon bundt cake, the same recipe she'd sold outside Kaya's theater, the one Colin once claimed could end wars. She left it on the kitchen counter in its delicate white box, waiting, perhaps foolishly, for him to notice. But he didn't. That evening, he walked in, kissed her forehead distractedly, mumbled about an email, and retreated to his office. Emery ate one slice alone and froze the rest. Later that night, she pulled his jacket from the coat rack to do laundry, a habit, and that's when it fell out. A red lipstick tube rolled across the hardwood floor, glinting under the lamp like a bloody secret. She stood there for a long time, the evidence staring at her, her heartbeat turning into thunder. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply placed it on his desk and went to bed without a word. Because sometimes the deepest betrayals don't arrive with fireworks, they arrive with silence, and they shatter what little light is left. The morning after the lipstick incident, Emery brewed coffee with mechanical movements, her hands steady but her insides spiraling. She didn't confront him immediately, not because she feared the truth, but because part of her already knew it. And the knowing was heavier than the confirmation. Colin emerged from the bedroom freshly showered, adjusting his tie, glancing past her like she was part of the furniture. Heading out early, he said without making eye contact. Emery didn't reply. She just slid the lipstick across the kitchen counter like a loaded gun. The moment his eyes landed on it, his smile faltered. His fingers froze on the knot of his tie. That's not mine, he said too quickly, too flatly, like someone reciting a line they'd prepared. Emery tilted her head, her voice dangerously calm. Of course not. Because you don't wear Rouge Obsession. There was a pause. Long enough for the truth to sit between them like a foul smell. Then came the defense, the accusations of paranoia, of invasion of privacy, of not trusting him. He flipped the script with surgical precision, accusing her of overreacting, of always looking for reasons to be unhappy. She said nothing at first, because the words she wanted to scream were too sharp to swallow. Finally, she said, I lost a child while you were out playing fantasy with someone else, and you think I'm the problem? He didn't respond. His silence was the cruelest confirmation of all. A week later, they were invited to a formal dinner hosted by Graham Ward, who had recently been promoted to senior partner at his law firm. Against her instincts, Emery went, not to play the supportive wife, but to see the people Colin had built this secret world with. The event was held at a high-rise penthouse in Tribeca, all polished glass and manicured cruelty. Emery wore a navy blue dress, simple but elegant, and walked in with her head high despite the storm inside her. As they entered, Vivian Doyle greeted them first, a sliver of surprise flickering in her eyes before she turned on that sharp, camera-ready smile. "Emery," she purred, offering air kisses, "you look radiant." Emery stared at her with an icy stillness. "Do I? I haven't been sleeping well. Must be the lipstick." The jab was subtle but not lost on Vivian, whose grin momentarily cracked. The rest of the evening unfolded like a slow-motion car crash. Emery watched Colin laugh too hard at Vivian's jokes, watched Vivian press her hand to his arm like it belonged there. And worse, she watched everyone else, Graham, the clients, the wives, watch her. Like she was the outsider. The unpolished accessory to Colin's bright future. The whispers stung, but the final blow came when Graham raised a toast and, with a smirk, said, to Colin, for rising so high, despite humble beginnings. The laughter that followed made Emery's skin crawl. Colin said nothing to defend her. They didn't speak on the ride home. Not on the elevator. Not when they entered the apartment. It wasn't until Emery turned to him, heels in hand, mascara smudged, heart shattered, that she finally asked, "How long has it been?" He didn't lie. 3 months, he said flatly. But it doesn't mean anything. Emery laughed, not from humor, but disbelief. You set fire to everything we built, and it doesn't mean anything? He began pacing, justifying, insisting that he felt trapped and suffocated, that she had become someone else, too consumed by grief and too small for the life he wanted. And then came the words that burned through her like acid, "You were always more of a burden than a partner." Her knees nearly buckled. Every sacrifice, every dream shelved, every smile faked for his benefit, dismissed like clutter. He called her a gold digger, said she latched onto his success because she couldn't create her own. That she was lucky he tolerated her as long as he had. It was cruel. Precise. Meant to wound. Emery didn't cry. She packed her suitcase with mechanical calm, one dress after another, folding her life into silence. When she reached the door, he tossed the divorce papers onto the counter without a word. "I'll have my lawyer handle the rest," he muttered. She turned only once to look at him, a man so foreign now, she wondered if she had ever truly known him, and said with ice in her voice, "Don't worry, Colin. I'll disappear so well, you'll think I never existed." And then she walked into the night, the city swallowing her whole, unaware that one day, she would rise with an empire under her name, and he would regret every word. The night air was bitter, but Emery barely noticed. Her fingers clenched the suitcase handle so tightly her knuckles blanched, the ache in her chest growing heavier with each step she took away from the apartment that once held her future. She didn't cry. Not on the subway. Not on the sidewalk. Not when the doorman avoided eye contact as she passed, nor when the cab driver asked, "Rough night," and she simply nodded. She ended up at Kaya's brownstone in Brooklyn, unannounced, past midnight, still wearing the navy dress from the dinner. Kaya opened the door in a robe, her short hair wild with sleep, and the moment she saw Emery's face, she didn't ask a single question. She simply pulled her inside, wrapped her in a blanket, and poured her tea. "You're safe here," she whispered. It was the first kindness Emery had felt in weeks, and it shattered the dam. She wept. Not like in the movies, no graceful tears down porcelain cheeks. This was ugly, gut-wrenching sobbing that came from a place so deep she'd forgotten it existed. Kaya held her, murmuring gentle words as if they were spells meant to protect her. That night, Emery didn't sleep. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, reliving every moment of the marriage she thought she had, wondering when the man she loved had turned into someone so vicious, so unfamiliar. The following weeks unfolded like a slow unraveling. Emery stayed in the small guest room above Kaya's makeshift home theater. The once hopeful boxes she'd packed with Colin became symbols of grief, cardboard tombstones for a life buried too soon. She got a job at a dusty bookstore cafe down the street, wiping tables and steaming oat milk lattes for underpaid artists and lonely professors. No one knew who she was or what she'd lost, and for a while, Emery preferred it that way. The anonymity gave her space to exist without expectation. But even that silence held weight. The whispers from neighbors, the occasional pitying look from someone who'd read about the Ward divorce in an online tabloid, stung like bee stings on an open wound. Kaya tried to be light in the darkness, bringing home pastries, playing old musicals, encouraging Emery to start baking again. But Emery couldn't touch flour without shaking. The very thing that once gave her peace now reminded her of all she'd lost. Her mother's health had declined rapidly, and June, barely balancing nursing school, was burning out. Emery felt like a ghost haunting her own story. She had no marriage, no business, no father, and no plan. Only the raw ache of survival. One afternoon, after another long shift of forced smiles and empty tips, Emery wandered to the Brooklyn promenade. The city skyline stretched before her, dazzling and cold. She pulled the wedding ring from her pocket, not because she missed it, but because it was time. She had worn it long past the divorce as a strange form of grief, a monument to all the ways she tried, to all the ways she loved blindly. But now, it felt like a curse. With trembling fingers, she stood at the edge of the railing, the river below glittering with indifferent beauty. She whispered, "I forgive you for not loving me. But I will never forget," and let the ring fall. It hit the water without sound, swallowed instantly. Emery didn't feel relief. Not yet. But she felt lighter, as if the universe had finally acknowledged her pain. She stood there for another hour, tears streaming quietly, and then walked home with no plan, no answers, only a spark of something she hadn't felt in months. Not hope. Not yet. But defiance. And in that fragile defiance, a new version of Emery began to stir, one the world hadn't met yet, but would never forget. The food truck festival in Williamsburg had always been one of Kaya's favorite local escapes, and on a chilly Sunday afternoon in late March, she dragged Emery out of the brownstone, insisting that air and food, real food, not bookstore croissants, would do her good. Emery resisted at first, still reluctant to be around crowds or laughter that wasn't hers. But Kaya was persistent. "You can't grieve forever in wool socks and silence, Em," she said, lacing her boots with a wink. The park was alive with energy, vibrant music, neon signs, the scent of cumin, melting cheese, and smoky ribs curling through the breeze like old jazz. Emery stood in line at a Nigerian jollof rice stall when she felt someone snap a picture. The click was soft but distinct. She turned sharply, ready to scold some influencer for invading her space, but instead found herself facing a man crouched slightly, holding a vintage Leica camera. He had warm brown skin, locks pulled into a loose knot, and an apologetic smile tugging at the edge of his mouth. "I'm sorry," he said, straightening. "It wasn't the food. It was you. You looked like someone remembering something painful and surviving it." His name was Landon Pierce, a 38-year-old travel photographer whose eyes held the stillness of someone who'd seen the world and returned quieter for it. Emery wasn't interested in small talk, but Landon wasn't trying to impress her. He spoke softly, choosing his words like they were precious things, and when Kaya joined them, ever the social butterfly, she coaxed his story out effortlessly. Landon had spent the last decade photographing rural life in Southeast Asia, conflict zones in Sudan, and quiet street portraits in Istanbul. But after losing his younger sister, Mara, to suicide, he stopped touring and started hosting free photography exhibits in Brooklyn. "Art is memory," he explained simply, "and grief needs a home." There was something in him that resonated with Emery, a man whose silence didn't feel empty, but safe. She didn't speak much that day, but before they parted, he handed her a photo, a black and white image of her, hair tousled by wind, eyes distant but unbroken. On the back, he had scribbled, "There is beauty in the pieces, too." She didn't know why it made her cry on the subway ride home, but she kept the photo anyway, pressed between the pages of a journal she hadn't opened since the divorce. Their friendship unfolded slowly, like a song without lyrics. Landon invited her to one of his photo exhibits at a reclaimed warehouse near Dumbo, and Emery agreed, though she hadn't attended anything social in months. She brought a small tray of ginger molasses cookies, an old family recipe, just as a thank you. The cookies were gone in 20 minutes. Several guests asked if she had a bakery. Landon, noticing the flicker of pride in her eyes, suggested, gently, that she bake for his next show. "Not as a vendor. As a co-creator," he said. Art and food. Grief and flavor. They go together more than people think. Emery hesitated but agreed. Over the next few weeks, she began experimenting in Kaya's kitchen again, tentatively at first, but then with more confidence. Her hands remembered what her heart had forgotten, how dough could be prayer, how butter could soften sadness. By the time the second exhibition opened, Emery had a display of her own, bittersweet bakes, pastries named after emotions, memories, and dreams. The guests loved it. She didn't wear makeup. Didn't need to. That night, Emery stood beside Landon, surrounded by photos and pastries, laughter and violin music, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel like the girl who had been thrown away. She felt like a woman reassembling herself. And though she wasn't ready to call it healing, she could finally admit, something inside her was waking up again. Time didn't pass loudly for Emery anymore. It drifted quietly, like dust settling on untouched furniture. 6 years moved through her life with the hushed rhythm of early dawn, subtle, almost unnoticed until one realized how much had changed. She never remarried. Never sought to. Her love had once been a wildfire, fierce and consuming, and its aftermath had left scars too deep to ignore. Instead, she focused on herself, on recovery, on learning how to live without needing someone else to define her. The tiny pastry venture she started with Landon evolved into something intimate and deeply personal. Every Friday evening, she hosted bakes and brews at an independent bookstore in Greenpoint, poetry readings, soft music, and desserts that tasted like nostalgia. People came not just for the treats, but for the tenderness. She had stopped advertising. She didn't need to. Word of mouth carried her story like folklore, a woman who baked pain into poetry. June, now 25, had become a full-time registered nurse and was working double shifts at a Queens clinic. Their mother, Ruth Ann, had passed 2 years prior, a quiet death, peaceful and unburdened, her last words to Emery being, "I always knew you'd rise again." Emery had spread her ashes in the Hudson, whispering her thanks to the woman who taught her that strength wasn't always loud. Sometimes, it was in the hands that kept giving, even while they trembled. Kaya remained Emery's closest tether to joy. Now the director of a community theater program for LGBTQ+ youth, she had carved her own name into Brooklyn's art scene. She and Emery shared Friday wine nights, talked about failed dates, bad scripts, and the small wins that made life worth trudging through. Landon never pushed for more than friendship, and Emery appreciated that. Their bond had grown into something sacred, two souls finding home in each other's silence. Occasionally, Emery would catch him watching her during the bake events, camera hanging loosely at his side, his eyes full of something that looked like admiration but never crossed the line. She didn't dare invite romance in. Not yet. Love had once been a house with no exits. She wasn't ready to build another. Instead, she poured her energy into rebuilding a version of herself that existed before Colin, the girl who believed in magic and small moments, and the smell of lavender and fresh cinnamon rolls. She traveled once, just once, to a quiet town in Vermont where she baked for a writer's retreat. No one there knew her past. She was just Emery Hale, the woman with kind eyes and a talent for making the world taste like home. Then came the letter. It arrived in a cream-colored envelope, addressed to Ms. Emery Eleanor Hale in crisp, professional ink. She found it wedged beneath her apartment door one rainy Thursday afternoon, after returning from a shipment pickup. At first, she assumed it was junk, another catering inquiry or invite to donate pastries for a cause. But the name of the sender made her blood still, Beckett and Rowe Attorneys at Law, Boston, Massachusetts. She sat on her couch for 20 minutes before opening it. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the thick paper and began to read. The letter stated that Emery was being summoned to Boston in relation to the estate of one Elias A. Ashcroft. The name hit her like a stone to the chest. Her father. A ghost. A name she hadn't spoken in over a decade. The firm claimed she was named as a sole beneficiary in his final will and testament, tied to an entity called Ashcroft Holdings, LLC. Confused, overwhelmed, and suddenly breathless, Emery reread the line a dozen times. As per the enclosed legal documentation, you are recognized under Massachusetts law as the sole heir to the Ashcroft estate, currently valued at over $1.2 billion. A laugh escaped her lips, bitter and cracked. It had to be a mistake. A cruel joke. Her father had abandoned them. She remembered poverty. She remembered unanswered letters and birthday candles blown out with whispered wishes that never came true. She didn't remember wealth. Certainly not empires. But the seal was real. The documents were real. And whether she liked it or not, a door she had long ago boarded shut had just creaked open, and behind it, an empire was waiting. The train ride to Boston felt like a journey into a past Emery had long buried and refused to exhume. As the Amtrak glided along the cold coastline, she stared out the window without really seeing, her thoughts swirling in chaos. Elias A. Ashcroft. The name pressed itself against her skull like an echo chamber. Her father had left when she was just a girl, vanishing like fog without a goodbye, a note, or an ounce of explanation. For years, she had wondered what she had done wrong, why he chose absence over presence, why their love hadn't been worth staying for. Her mother had said little about him, only that he was a man burdened by things she couldn't begin to carry for him. Emery once imagined him dead, a casualty of heartbreak or failure. But now, she learned he hadn't just lived, he had thrived. He had built a billion-dollar empire behind velvet curtains while she and June rationed electricity and prayed the landlord wouldn't knock. The letter from Beckett and Rowe hadn't been vague. The documents included copies of corporate registrations, property deeds, investment portfolios, and the final signed will that bore both her father's name and hers, Emery Eleanor Ashcroft. The name she was given at birth, legally unamended, though her mother stopped using it after Elias left. It had become a ghost of a surname, one she hadn't seen in over 20 years. Now, that ghost had returned with a crown. At the law firm's office, everything smelled like old money and polished marble. A man in a slate-gray suit introduced himself as Christopher Rowe, executor of Elias Ashcroft's estate. He didn't smile much but carried the kind of reverence reserved for speaking about the dead with weight. Emery sat in a cold leather chair, her hands folded in her lap, as he began his explanation. Her father, according to Rowe, had started Ashcroft Holdings in the late 90s, amassing silent ownership in shipping, tech, and real estate industries. No public records tied him directly to the firm, it was all nested in offshore trusts, shell corporations, and legal camouflage. Mr. Ashcroft preferred to work in the shadows, Rowe explained, until the final years of his life when he began preparing this transition. Emery was stunned. He knew about me? All this time? She asked. Rowe nodded solemnly and handed her a sealed envelope. He left you this. And a gift of sorts. But first, there's someone else you should speak to. Before she could respond, the door opened, and in stepped a woman in her late 60s, with silver hair pulled into a bun, piercing eyes, and a familiar warmth, the kind that scraped at memories. Emery, the woman said gently. I'm Clara Hastings. I knew your father. I worked with him for nearly 3 decades. And he never stopped loving you. Emery's breath caught. The room tilted slightly. The truth was no longer abstract, it had a voice, a face, and a history she didn't yet understand. Later that afternoon, they took her to the building. Towering, glass-fronted, and bearing no signage, it was nestled discreetly between 2 luxury firms in Boston's financial district. Clara explained that this had been the heart of Ashcroft Holdings, quiet, discreet, efficient. Your father didn't want attention. He wanted legacy, she said. The elevator ride to the 48th floor felt endless. When the doors opened, Emery stepped into a boardroom frozen in time, the air still faintly scented with sandalwood and aged paper. The desk bore Elias' nameplate. On the far wall was a portrait, not of Elias himself, but a charcoal sketch of Emery as a child, holding a whisk and standing beside a flower-covered kitchen counter. Her knees nearly buckled. He had that drawn from a photograph, Clara said softly. It hung there every day until his death. Emery moved slowly through the space, touching the edges of furniture, papers, files, trying to find pieces of herself in this empire of stone. But it wasn't just stone. It was story. Her story. A legacy born from abandonment, pain, secrets, and now, reclamation. Elias Ashcroft had left his kingdom not to the world, not to shareholders, not to heirs bred in boardrooms, but to the daughter he walked away from, hoping she would one day return and reclaim her forgotten name. And now, with that name echoing in every corner of the room, Emery faced the impossible. Could she rule an empire built by a man who'd broken her? Or would she finally break the cycle and rebuild it into something entirely her own? The Ashcroft boardroom was both majestic and lifeless, a tomb of leather chairs, untouched documents, and a view that overlooked the heart of Boston's wealth, yet somehow made Emery feel entirely alone. Clara Hastings walked beside her, explaining the bones of the empire Elias had left behind. Ashcroft Holdings was no longer the gleaming crown jewel it had once been. Though the company still technically owned over 24 properties, a shipping subsidiary, and considerable stock in tech startups, it was also drowning in hidden debts, pending lawsuits, and several dormant contracts. Your father's brilliance, Clara said cautiously, was also his flaw. He operated in secrecy so long that when he fell ill, no one could stop the cracks from spreading. Emery stared at the massive portrait of the skyline hung behind the desk. She couldn't reconcile the thought of her father as both a titan of business and the man who'd abandoned her family. Why me? She whispered. Clara hesitated. Because even when he left, he believed in your resilience. And in the end, this legacy was the only way he knew how to say sorry. The irony burned. Her father hadn't raised her, hadn't even written, yet here she stood, not as a daughter, but as a savior to an empire that had forgotten its humanity. Later, Clara led her to a private room tucked behind the executive floor, a suite Elias used in his final months when traveling became impossible. The room was plain, save for a shelf of journals and a wooden trunk bearing Emery's initials. With trembling hands, she opened the journals and began reading the entries. They were not about business, but about her. Pages upon pages documenting her childhood from afar, her high school play, her first bake sale, her engagement, and even her divorce. He had private investigators track you, Clara admitted gently. Not to harm, but because he didn't know how to reconnect. He watched. He wept. Emery flipped through the pages like peeling layers of someone else's grief, discovering newspaper clippings, photographs of her bakery stand in Portland, even receipts for donations he made anonymously in her name. The man she had hated all her life had been quietly building a shrine to her from the shadows. It didn't erase the abandonment. It didn't make her whole. But it cracked the ice that had sealed off that part of her heart. She closed the final journal and whispered aloud to the silence, "Why didn't you just come home?" Standing in the middle of the 48th floor again, Emery stared at the city through the wall-length windows. Below her, Ashcroft Holdings was barely breathing, a legacy with a heartbeat too faint to hear unless you leaned in close. Clara handed her a portfolio with more legal paperwork and asset breakdowns than Emery could possibly understand in one sitting. "You can walk away," she said gently. "The inheritance is yours regardless. You could sell the assets, take the money, and never look back." The offer echoed temptingly. Emery could return to Brooklyn, rebuild her bakery with more than enough funding, support June's clinic dreams, sponsor Kaya's theater. She could live comfortably and quietly. But something inside her resisted the thought. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was vengeance. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the desire to prove to the world, and to herself, that she was more than what anyone had ever labeled her. Not Colin's ex, not the daughter who got left behind. But a woman with vision, grit, and an empire now placed in her hands not because she earned it, but because she had survived enough to reclaim it. "I'm staying," she said at last. "I'm going to rebuild this. Not for him. Not for legacy. But for every girl who's ever been discarded and still found a way to rise." Clara nodded, pride flickering in her eyes. "Then let's begin." And just like that, Emery Emery Eleanor Ashcroft, stepped forward into the ashes of her father's kingdom, not as a grieving daughter, but as a storm in waiting. The first day back at the Ashcroft building as its rightful heir felt less like a coronation and more like stepping onto a battlefield. Emery stood at the front entrance alone, wearing a tailored black coat over her thrifted navy dress, clutching a leather-bound notebook and a vision too large to be understood just yet. Inside, the silence greeted her like an old ghost, and the employees who remained, barely a dozen, watched her with cautious, almost disbelieving eyes. Some had been with the company since Elias's reign and whispered about his lost daughter as if she were a myth come to life. Others were bitter, exhausted by the financial purgatory they'd been trapped in for years. Emery gathered them all in the boardroom that afternoon, no suits, no catered lunch, just truth. She stood in front of them and said, "I don't have a business degree. I'm not here to impress you with spreadsheets. I'm here because this company was built with brilliance and broken by pride. But I believe it can be whole again if we build something different this time. Some remained skeptical. But one by one, they listened. By the end of the meeting, a spark had returned to the room, not trust, not yet, but something close to belief. And belief, Emery knew, was the only currency she had right now. She didn't do it alone. Her first call was to Kaya, who flew in the following week with 2 overstuffed carry-ons, a fire in her chest, and a head full of branding strategies. You give me 6 months, Kaya said, rolling her sleeves up in the empty PR office, and I'll turn this ghost town into a phoenix. Her second call was to June, who had been on the fence about leaving her clinic in Queens until Emery offered her something radical, the opportunity to lead Ashcroft's new medical grant program, focused on underserved communities. You won't be a nurse anymore, Emery said. You'll be the one helping fund 10,000 more like you. June cried for 5 minutes straight before saying yes. The third addition to her team was Landon, who hesitated until Emery showed him the building's 14th floor, the old creative media department, abandoned and dust-covered. You wanted a home for your stories, she said. Well, here's a rooftop studio and a blank slate. Document the resurrection. He didn't answer with words. He just kissed her forehead and got to work. Together, they formed the beating heart of a new empire, not built on fear and secrecy, but on truth, vision, and second chances. Emery called it Project Homecoming, a quiet nod to the journey it took just to get back here. But rebuilding wasn't romantic. It was exhausting. The first month was a storm of legal audits, property reappraisals, debt restructuring, and employee reevaluations. Emery read contracts until her eyes blurred. She fired 6 executives who had been pocketing salaries while producing nothing. She restructured departments, held open-door feedback sessions, and even sat down with janitorial staff to ask what they'd improve. Clara Hastings became her mentor, her compass through the corporate terrain, while Kaya transformed the Ashcroft brand from stiff corporate elitism into something fresh, young, and socially conscious. The new Ashcroft vision wasn't about domination, it was about rebuilding what power had broken. Emery launched a flagship initiative, Ashcroft Rebuilds, focusing on reinvesting 20% of profits into women-owned businesses, community shelters, and educational grants. Her story spread like wildfire across local media, the forgotten heiress who chose to stay. Old critics scoffed, calling it performative. But survivors recognized her. They saw the girl who had lost everything and still showed up. And for the first time in years, Emery didn't just feel useful, she felt powerful. Not in the way Colin had chased, not through wealth or attention, but in the quiet, unshakable way that came from earning something no one could take away. Her name. Her legacy. Her resurrection. Colin Ward had once believed Emery would quietly fade away after the divorce, just another forgettable woman who couldn't keep up with his ambitions. But the headlines told a different story. Ashcroft heiress reclaims empire splashed across business sites, finance magazines, and online blogs, accompanied by pictures of Emery stepping out of boardrooms in tailored blazers and heels, smiling gently while flanked by her team. At first, he thought it was a coincidence. But the more he read, the clearer it became. Emery Hale was now Emery Eleanor Ashcroft, the sole heir to the multi-billion-dollar Ashcroft holdings, and she was thriving. Colin, on the other hand, was sinking. After Vivian Doyle's sudden disappearance, taking millions in embezzled client funds with her, Colin was left to shoulder the blame. Investigations launched. Clients fled. He was terminated without severance, and the firm quietly blacklisted his name from their networks. His reputation, once the source of his pride, became his prison. He tried to launch a consulting firm, but no one trusted him. With mounting legal fees, overdue rent, and a dwindling savings account, Colin did the one thing he had sworn never to do. He reached out to Emery. He showed up unannounced at the Ashcroft headquarters, dressed in an old navy blazer that no longer fit and carrying nothing but the weight of his downfall. The receptionist almost didn't let him in. It was Clara Hastings who saw him first, and her face tightened with quiet contempt. "You've got nerve," she said coldly. But Emery, ever composed, agreed to see him. She waited for him in the same boardroom where her father's portrait hung, the same room where she had decided to resurrect the empire from its ruins. When Colin walked in, he looked older, not in years, but in wear. The lines on his face were deeper, his shoulders slouched. He said softly, I heard everything. I didn't know. Emery didn't smile. Didn't offer him a seat. She stood behind the long table, arms crossed, voice level. You didn't know because you never cared to. You assumed I was nothing without you. And now you're here because you've lost everything. His eyes welled with tears, whether from regret or shame she couldn't tell. I made mistakes, he whispered. I lost myself. She tilted her head. No. You revealed yourself. He begged. Not for money, not directly, but for redemption. He talked about the sleepless nights, about how Vivian used him, about how he missed the simple life they once shared. You made me feel seen, he said. I took it for granted. Emery listened. Not because she felt pity, but because closure mattered. When he finished, there was silence between them, thick and final. She stepped forward slowly, eyes locked on his. You didn't just leave me, Colin. You broke me. And then you watched me bleed without flinching. She placed a folded piece of paper on the table. This is the address to a food bank and shelter program I now fund under Ashcroft Rebuilds. If you're serious about finding purpose, start there. But you won't find it here. He looked stunned. So that's it? She smiled, not cruelly, but with strength. That's everything. And as she turned and walked away, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor, Colin remained standing in a room that once belonged to her father, now ruled by the woman he had underestimated. Outside, the city pulsed with life, but inside, the air was still. The storm had passed, and Emery had not only survived it, she had outgrown it. Kaya Torres had always been a force, loud, passionate, unpredictable, the kind of woman who turned rooms into theaters just by walking in. But few knew the depth beneath her brilliance. Born to a Dominican mother who worked 2 cleaning jobs and a father who disappeared before her 2nd birthday, Kaya learned early on that she'd have to be her own kind of magic. She grew up in a 1-bedroom apartment in the Bronx, reading monologues under dim light bulbs while her mother slept. Theater wasn't just a dream, it was her survival. It gave her voice in a world that tried to mute her. In high school, she was bullied mercilessly, for being queer, for her thrift store clothes, for the fire in her eyes that refused to dim. But she never broke. She made her way through community college on scholarships, staged tiny shows in church basements, and eventually carved out a niche running youth theater programs out of borrowed school auditoriums. By the time Emery invited her to join the Ashcroft Rebirth team, Kaya hadn't stepped on stage herself in almost 5 years. I help others perform now, she told Emery once. But my spotlight days are over. Emery didn't argue. She just listened and waited. What Emery gave Kaya wasn't just funding, it was freedom. The Ashcroft Foundation provided a grant to launch Stage Forward, a creative arts program for marginalized youth, LGBTQ+ teens, foster care survivors, first-generation immigrants. Kaya found an abandoned historic theater in Roxbury, its velvet curtains torn, its stage cracked, but its bones still glorious. She oversaw every inch of its restoration. She painted the lobby walls with quotes from Maya Angelou and James Baldwin, rewired the lighting system with the help of local volunteers, and built a dressing room filled with mirrors framed in affirmations. The night before opening, Kaya stood center stage, barefoot, holding her breath as the spotlight hummed to life above her. It wasn't a performance, it was a reckoning. Emery sat in the front row, June beside her, Landon quietly filming from the aisle. The first play was titled Paper Hearts, written and directed by Kaya herself, a semi-autobiographical piece about identity, shame, and finding your voice. The cast? Teenagers who'd never been on stage before. Some stuttered. Some cried. All were magnificent. When the lights dimmed and the audience erupted in applause, Kaya didn't bow. She stood frozen for a moment, tears streaking her cheeks, before finally raising her fist and whispering, "We're here." After the show, Emery wrapped her arms around her best friend, squeezing tightly. "You didn't just build a program," she said. "You built a revolution." Kaya laughed, wiping her eyes. "I just built the stage." They lit the fire. The press took notice, dubbing Stage Forward one of the boldest nonprofit art projects in Massachusetts. Donations poured in. Other cities called. Kaya remained grounded, insisting that the soul of the program could never be duplicated because it was born from pain, from joy, from a community no one else could replicate. Emery watched from a respectful distance, proud not just of Kaya's success, but of what it symbolized. That legacy could look like laughter and spotlights just as much as numbers and skyscrapers. That healing could take the form of children pretending to be dragons or poets or ghosts. That sometimes, the best revenge wasn't just surviving, it was giving others the wings you were denied. That night, after the crowd dispersed, Emery and Kaya sat cross-legged on the stage floor with takeout boxes and sparkling cider. You realize, Kaya said, bumping shoulders, we've both built the lives we once only dreamed of. Emery nodded, eyes glossy. And it's only the beginning. They clanked their paper cups together and laughed like girls who had nothing, and now held everything. June Hale had spent most of her life in someone else's shadow, first their father's, then her mother's illness, and later, Emery's brilliance. But none of it had been Emery's fault. Emery had always protected her, encouraged her, shielded her from the worst of their poverty, from the storm that followed their father's disappearance and the long silence that settled in after. June was the dreamer who kept getting dragged back to earth by circumstance. She loved anatomy and rescue shows as a kid, dreamed of being a trauma surgeon, and used to pretend her dolls had broken limbs she had to mend. But dreams required money, and after high school, they only had enough for survival. Emery took on every burden without complaint, and June carried guilt more than she carried ambition. When their mother's health worsened, she dropped out of school for 2 years to become a home care aide just to stay close. She saw what Emery sacrificed, and she resented the world for never seeing it. So, when Emery inherited the Ashcroft empire and offered her the chance to lead a community health initiative, June froze, not from ungratefulness, but disbelief. You want me to lead? She asked. I haven't even finished school. Emery smiled gently. You've been leading since you were 19. You just didn't have a title. June took the job, reluctantly at first. She moved into one of the Ashcroft Foundation's sponsored brownstones near Cambridge and began working with local clinics to identify gaps in healthcare access. For the first time in her life, people listened when she spoke. Doctors asked her opinion. Directors wanted her insight. She enrolled part-time at Boston College to finally finish her bachelor's degree and later began coursework for her master's in public health. But what truly transformed her was the free First Saturdays program she developed, rotating wellness clinics hosted in underserved neighborhoods, where volunteers offered blood pressure checks, free prescriptions, maternal health classes, and mental health counseling. Her first event served over 700 residents, many of whom had never seen a doctor in over a decade. Emery stood quietly in the back, watching her little sister walk through the crowd with confidence, clipboard in one hand, stethoscope in the other. June was no longer the girl begging the universe for direction. She was a compass now, sharp, grounded, radiant. And Emery couldn't stop the tears that slid down her cheek as she realized something beautiful. June no longer needed saving. She had become the light. That night, Emery surprised June with a gift she had been quietly preparing for months, a renovated cottage on the outskirts of Boston, nestled between a trail of maple trees and a small lake, complete with a sunroom for studying and a backyard garden their mother would have adored. June walked through the door speechless, her hand trembling as she reached for the keys. You've always given to everyone else, Emery whispered. This is something that's just yours. They sat on the back porch wrapped in blankets, watching the stars blink into the sky, and talked about their mother. About how strong she was. About how she would have cried seeing both her daughters thriving in a world that once crushed them. Later, they visited Ruth Ann's grave with sunflowers and gingerbread cookies, her favorites. They knelt together in silence before June leaned forward and said, "We're okay now, Mom." Emery made sure of it. "And I promise, I'll carry the light from here." That moment wasn't loud. No fanfare. No headlines. But in that graveyard, surrounded by quiet winds and legacies wait, the Hale sisters closed one chapter of their story. And somewhere in the sky above, stars shifted, making space for what would come next. It was Clara Hastings who handed Emery the key, a slender brass thing, unmarked, slightly rusted with time. "He asked that you open it alone," she said softly. The door was hidden in plain sight on the 47th floor, tucked behind a false bookshelf in Elias Ashcroft's private suite. Emery had walked past it several times and never thought to look twice. Inside, the room smelled like cedar and old paper, not the sterile scent of wealth, but something more human. There were no windows, only a single desk, 2 chairs, and a steel vault built into the wall. Emery's hand trembled slightly as she unlocked it. Inside were hard drives, stacks of handwritten letters, a bound leather journal, and several flash drives marked by a year. She took everything to the boardroom and began the long process of reading. The first video file was dated 2016. Her father's face, older and worn, appeared on screen. His voice cracked as he spoke. "If you're watching this, then I've failed in life, but perhaps not in love." Emery's breath caught. Over the course of 6 hours, she watched her father unfold, not as a businessman, but as a broken man haunted by choices. He spoke about the night he left, how financial ruin and legal threats from powerful enemies forced him into hiding. "They were going to hurt your mother," he said, eyes glistening. "So I disappeared. I thought I was protecting you. But I see now I was only running from the guilt." One journal revealed more details, how Elias built Ashcroft Holdings under layers of legal insulation, keeping his name far removed from its assets. How he anonymously funded Ruth Ann's medical care in her final years, setting up a trust he never claimed publicly. How he kept surveillance on Emery's bakery stall, Landon's photo exhibit, even Kaya's theater, not out of control, but quiet admiration. "I watched you become a woman of fire," one journal entry read. "I wanted to say something. But what right did I have?" Emery wept reading those words, not just for the pain they carried, but for the strange validation they offered. She had imagined him dead for so long, it was almost more painful to know he was alive, watching, regretting, hiding behind walls of shame and security. She found receipts for donations made in her name to schools, small bakeries across the country, scholarships for women in culinary arts. He had been trying, in the only way he knew how, to make amends. And now, those unfinished amends sat in her hands like a puzzle she had to complete. She wasn't just rebuilding a company, she was rewriting a man's legacy with eyes wide open. 3 weeks later, Emery stood before a panel of state officials and legal representatives, holding the very documents that would clear her father's name. She filed for public transparency under Ashcroft Holdings, unsealing decades of shell operations and redirecting them toward verified nonprofit work. In a televised press briefing, she stood beneath the company banner, flanked by Clara, June, and Kaya, and delivered the speech she had once sworn she would never give. "My father was not a perfect man," she said. "But he was a man who tried. And in the end, he left me more than a fortune. He left me truth, and the responsibility to turn pain into purpose." The press ran with it. "The Empire Daughter," one headline read. "From betrayed to boardroom." Yet behind the cameras, the moment was more sacred than strategic. Emery returned to the 47th floor that evening, placed the last journal on the shelf, and lit a single candle beside her father's sketch of her as a child. "I don't forgive you," she whispered. "But I understand now. And maybe that's enough." The flame flickered, catching the reflection of her name etched in brass on the office door, Emery E. Ashcroft, Chief Executive Officer. It wasn't just a title anymore. It was a declaration. She had finally turned her father's ghost into a foundation, not just for herself, but for everyone she vowed to uplift in his absence. The past has a peculiar way of showing up just when you think you've outrun it, dressed in an expensive suit, holding a subpoena. The letter arrived on a Monday morning, hand-delivered to Ashcroft headquarters. Emery was reviewing expansion proposals for the Rebuild initiative when Clara entered her office, face pale, folder in hand. "You'll want to sit for this," she said. Inside was a formal notice from Graham Ward, Colin's older brother, a motion challenging the legitimacy of her ownership over Ashcroft Holdings. He was alleging mental incompetence, claiming Emery was emotionally unstable, unqualified, and had manipulated her way into power using the confusion of her late father's estate. Attached were screenshots from old tabloids, biased articles from Colin's divorce filings, and social media speculation questioning how a failed baker could suddenly run a billion-dollar empire. At first, Emery didn't speak. She just stared at the paper, heart thudding in her ears, hands trembling slightly. But when she finally looked up, her voice was ice. "He's trying to take the only thing I rebuilt from ashes." Clara nodded grimly. "He's counting on your silence, your fear. You don't have to give him either." Emery stood slowly, spine straightening. Call Landon. Call Kaya. Call everyone. I'm not afraid of ghosts. The courtroom was packed when the hearing began, a media circus swarming outside, murmurs trailing inside. Graham stood in polished arrogance, his legal team stacked high with binders and courtroom theatrics. Emery, however, entered with quiet fire, dressed in a steel gray suit, hair pinned back, no jewelry but a thin gold locket at her throat. Clara sat behind her, Landon and Kaya flanking the second row, June clasping her hands in silent support. The opposing counsel opened with venomous precision, painting Emery as emotionally unstable, using the trauma of abandonment and a failed marriage to suggest she was vulnerable to delusions of grandeur. They even tried to twist her philanthropic work as excessive generosity, suggesting it stemmed from guilt, not business acumen. Emery listened, jaw tight, hands clasped on the table. But when her time came, she didn't read from notes. She stood, walked to the center of the room, and said, I don't need to prove that I'm my father's daughter. I've already done what he never could, I've made this company human. She listed every Ashcroft employee restored, every debt resolved, every dollar reinvested into people. Her voice didn't rise, it resonated. You see me as a threat because I did what you never dared to, I rose from failure with empathy instead of ego. The judge recessed for 48 hours before returning with a decision. Emery sat with June beside her, heart pounding, palms damp. When the gavel finally struck and the ruling was read, the courtroom exhaled. Motion denied. Case dismissed. The Ashcroft estate remained under Emery's rightful ownership, and Graham's petition was formally deemed baseless, opportunistic, and vindictive. A ripple of quiet applause echoed through the chamber. Graham stormed out, jaw clenched, reputation irreparably bruised. Emery, meanwhile, remained seated for a full minute, breathing through the surge of emotions, relief, triumph, exhaustion. When she finally rose, the press swarmed, but she said nothing. She walked straight into the sun outside, met by Landon's proud grin and Kaya's tearful hug. You were a damn hurricane in there, Kaya whispered. Emery only smiled, eyes skyward. Let them come. I'm not running anymore. That night, as city lights blinked beneath her office windows, Emery stood alone in her father's chair, not as the daughter he left, or the wife discarded, but as a woman who stared down every ghost in her past and didn't just survive. She won. The courtroom victory had brought Emery public vindication, but privately, her spirit felt frayed at the edges. The past 7 months had been an unrelenting storm, boardrooms, press briefings, legal attacks, and a whirlwind of responsibilities that never quite allowed her to breathe. Landon noticed it before anyone else did. He saw it in the way she rubbed her temples between meetings, how she stood in her office long after the building emptied, staring out at the city with a far-off look in her eyes. One evening, after she canceled their third coffee in a week, he appeared at her office door with 2 plane tickets and said only, "Come with me." She didn't ask where. She just nodded. They landed in Iceland 2 days later, the frostbitten landscape stretching endlessly beneath a sky that seemed to hold its breath. They stayed in a quiet wooden cabin with no cell reception, no internet, and a fireplace that crackled like soft applause. For the first time in years, Emery was unreachable, unobserved. She didn't bring her laptop. She didn't bring makeup. She brought only her journals, her silence, and the quiet ache of a woman still learning how to exhale. They spent their days walking across mossy cliffs and black sand beaches, sipping bitter coffee in local cafes, and listening to glaciers groan in the distance. Landon never asked her to talk. He simply offered her space, something she hadn't realized she needed so badly. On the third night, they climbed a frozen ridge to watch the northern lights. The sky erupted in ribbons of green and purple, dancing across the stars like something ancient had awakened. Emery stood in awe, breath catching in her throat, when Landon gently lifted his camera. "Don't move," he whispered. The shutter clicked once. She didn't pose. Didn't smile. She simply stood there, wrapped in a wool scarf, eyes wide, face unguarded, and for the first time, fully present. After the lights faded, they sat on the snowy ground, shoulder to shoulder, wrapped in silence. Landon finally spoke, his voice barely audible over the wind. "You don't have to carry it all, Em." She looked at him, tears brimming. "I know," she whispered. "But I needed to first." They didn't kiss. There was no grand declaration. Just the gentle certainty that they understood one another in a language deeper than words. When they returned to Boston a week later, Emery found the photograph printed and framed, leaning against her office wall. It was breathtaking. Not because of the northern lights, but because of her. She didn't recognize the woman in the photo at first. She looked strong, grounded, soft but unshakable. It wasn't the face of someone who had conquered the world. It was the face of someone who had finally come home to herself. Emery placed the photograph on the mantel beside her father's charcoal sketch and lit a single candle. That evening, she walked the halls of Ashcroft Holdings, speaking to her staff not as a CEO, but as a woman who had survived, rebuilt, and now wanted to lead with grace. She met with interns, praised janitors, and took the time to thank each department individually. Landon joined her quietly, camera tucked away. He knew the best moments weren't always captured. Sometimes, they were lived. That night, Emery journaled beneath the stars outside her apartment balcony, writing one simple line beneath the drawing of the aurora: healing is not forgetting. It is remembering without letting it break you. And with that, she closed the chapter of the woman she used to be. Tomorrow, she would open a new one, not for survival, not for legacy, but for joy. The morning sun broke across the Boston skyline in soft golds and silvers, bathing the newly completed Ashcroft Center for Women in Business in a warm, luminous glow. The building stood tall but not imposing, glass-paneled, open concept, surrounded by a community garden and an outdoor cafe that Emery insisted be run by local female entrepreneurs. Its mission was simple: empower women to build, grow, and reclaim their own narratives. This opening wasn't marked by celebrity guests or billionaire panels. Emery had made it clear: no red carpets, no press circus. Just people who understood what it meant to rebuild. The courtyard filled slowly with faces from her journey: June, radiant and finally at peace; Kaya, dressed in a sequined blazer and handing out stage program flyers to curious attendees; Clara, seated near the fountain with her cane, nodding proudly; and Landon, standing at the edge with his camera slung over his shoulder, no longer just documenting, but witnessing. There was no grand speech, no ceremonial ribbon-cutting rehearsed for perfection. Emery stood at the center of the entrance, surrounded by those who had walked through her storms, and simply smiled as a child ran past her and squealed, "Is she the queen of this place?" Emery knelt beside the girl, whose name was Aria, and asked, "Do queens make cupcakes and clean their own desks?" The girl giggled and shook her head. "Then no," Emery said with a wink. "I'm just a baker." Laughter rippled through the crowd, not at her, but with her, the sound of something sacred being born. Inside the center, conference rooms were named after women who had changed the course of Emery's life: Ruth Ann, Eleanor, Kaya, June, even Mara, Landon's sister. The main studio featured a gallery wall displaying photographs of women-owned businesses supported by the Ashcroft Foundation. On another wall, framed in oak, was the last photo Landon had taken in Iceland: Emery beneath the aurora, face open, soul unarmored. Beneath it read the words, "She rose." Not to prove them wrong, but to show herself she could. Guests wandered the rooms in awe, some crying, others silent. In every corner of the building, Emery's story was etched, not in marble, but in warmth, purpose, and radical softness. She had not inherited a throne. She had built a sanctuary. Later that evening, when the guests had gone and the staff were cleaning up, Emery stood alone in her new office, walls lined with books, windows open to the sound of the city. She stared out at the skyline, no longer feeling haunted by what was lost, but anchored by what was found. June texted her a photo of their mother's garden necklace now hanging in her own cottage's window. Kaya sent a blurry video of teens rehearsing a new play inspired by paper hearts. Landon, ever minimal, simply left a note on her desk: "Take a break. You've earned one." Emery smiled and finally allowed herself to breathe deeply. Not from obligation, not from exhaustion, but from joy. She walked to the window and whispered, "Thank you," to no one in particular. And for the first time in years, she wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. She wasn't trying to be perfect or prove her worth. She was simply living. Owning her space. Walking into the next chapter not as someone defined by pain, but by power, peace, and purpose. This wasn't a return. It wasn't revenge. It was rebirth. And in that moment, Emery Eleanor Ashcroft finally stepped fully into the light of her new beginning. The end.